This is the Leon Charney Report. And now, here is your host, Leon Charney.
Welcome. It's a sweltering summer, and there are a lot of sweltering problems running around in the world today. One of them is, are Jews disappearing? Now, you probably read it in New York Magazine, and we have with us Craig Horowitz, who wrote this. Let's show the magazine. It's a Magen David, in case you're not Jewish, Star of David, and it's a very intense article. Craig, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Whose idea to write this article?
It was my idea to do the piece.
Are you Jewish?
Yes, I'm Jewish.
Did it matter?
No, it didn't matter. I don't think it mattered at all. It's an interesting subject. It's something I've been thinking about for a long time.
All right, easy question. Are Jews disappearing?
Are Jews disappearing? Well, I think there's two parts. There's a two-part answer to that question. There's essentially what's going on is there are two countervailing trends in the Jewish community right now. On the one hand, you have a sort of grassroots revival movement that's taking place where Jews are returning to their roots, returning to religion, and you can see that certainly around New York, but in most parts of the country. So that's a positive sign. On the other hand, Jews are opting out of their religion and giving up their religion in record numbers. It's interesting that the American Jewish community, which is arguably the most powerful, the most creative, diverse diaspora Jewish community in history, feels now in a real way that it's under siege, that there are certain enemies now attacking the community, but they're attacking from within. Assimilation, intermarriage, indifference. The intermarriage right now is over 50%.
Well, you have an interesting statistic. You say that Jews were 4% of the population about 30, 40 years ago?
Yes, in 1950.
And they're still the same 4% now when the population of the United States is 250 million.
Actually, they're not. What's interesting is they're not the same 4%. What's stayed the same is the total number of American Jews is about 5.5 million right now, which is the same as the number was in 1950. But because the American population has grown from 150 million to 250 million, Jews are now only a little over 2% of the population.
Right, so it's been cut down.
Yeah, almost by half as a percentage,
It's an alarming statistic.
Yeah, it's a real problem. I mean, you have to say no one has established a tipping point or a threshold below which that number becomes a serious problem, but all you have to do is look at the fact that at 2% of the population and falling, how can you maintain the cultural existence that Jews have enjoyed in this country? How can you maintain the rich institutional Jewish life that has been here? I think that the numbers become a real issue below 2%.
Well, Alan Dershowitz wrote a book about something about assimilation, claiming that basically 50 years from now, the Jews will either be Haredim or very Orthodox Jews who live up in a New City or Suffern, New Jersey, and the rest will be assimilated. And he's really worried about it. And as you call him in your article, it's an evangelist, I think, right?
Something like that.
Something like that. He's running around trying to make sure that Jews don't assimilate. Yet on the same hand, or the other hand, his son married a non-Jew, and he's really upset about it. He said it on the show. But he loves his kids, and he's worried about his grandchildren. That's
right.
He's parading around trying to get the affirmative, positive aspects of Judaism, in a sense of cultural Judaism. You say they tried it 25 years ago, or somebody else said it in your article, it doesn't work.
Well, I think you have to look at what's happened to the American Jewish community over the last 30 or 40 years. There was a time 30 or 40 years ago when Jews didn't really have to worry about their Judaism. They didn't have to worry about being Jewish. Their primary concern was succeeding in America, becoming good American citizens, and really being competitive in a democratic society. Their Jewishness took care of itself. They lived essentially in Jewish communities, socialized with essentially other Jewish people. They shopped in primarily Jewish stores. Their kids all grew up and married other Jewish kids. And then on top of that, there were these external factors that were at play. That united the community, which things like the Holocaust, the building and survival of Israel, making sure that Jews around the world were safe. So there was this sort of cultural, social, political glue that united Jews in a way that superseded belief in God or superseded religion. But all of those factors now have changed. Jews don't live primarily in Jewish neighborhoods for the most part anymore. They intermarry at an alarming rate. We talked about that a little earlier. So that social, cultural, political glue has disappeared. So what is it that's going to hold the Jewish community together at this point? Because the ethnic part is disappearing.
All right, that's a fascinating question. And later on the show, we'll bring on Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg, who's a very, very renowned scholar of Orthodox Judaism, and also we'll bring on Jonathan Rosen, who's cultural editor of The Forward, and we'll have a great panel about this. You don't have to be Jewish to like the show today, by the way. It's important. And you bring out in your article, Jews are 10% of the Congress or Senate. You got 2 Jews who are on the Supreme Court, yes. Bader and Breyer.
Right.
They're all over the place, Jews. They're in banking. They're in publishing. 20, 30, 40 years ago, it was not the case.
Right.
So the real problem that you think is that they become so assimilated is there any need for Judaism?
Well, it's not even a question of is there any need for Judaism, but it's a question of is this success in America killing Jews off? Is this kind of really in a serious way diminishing the Jewish community? What's happened now is that being Jewish is less about bagels and Bloomingdale's now than it used to be. Now being Jewish really is becoming more about the religion.
Is there a difference between being Jewish and being a Jew?
Absolutely.
Tough question.
Well, I think there's a difference, because I think that if you ask somebody, are you a Jew, and he or she says yes, that makes them a Jew, essentially. The rabbi, I'm sure, would argue with this, but certainly if somebody has a Jewish mother, I think everybody would agree that that makes that person a Jew. Whether he or she is observant, goes to synagogue, observes any of the Jewish law, is irrelevant.
Well, a Reform and conservative Jew would say if the father's Jewish, it's enough.
Right. Well, that sort of begins to complicate things a little bit. So then you run into the question of 50 years from now, what will it mean to say that you're a Jew? Right now, it's really the master identity for most people. And by that I mean, if somebody is Jewish, he or she considers himself to be a Jew above everything else. 50 years from now, it might be that somebody says, well, if you ask somebody, what are you? They might say, well, I'm part Jewish, the way somebody now says, I'm part Scotch, or I'm part Italian, or I'm part whatever.
You say Amish and Quakers. There'll be a small Jewish group called the Amish, the Jewish, and the Quakers. I read that in your piece.
Yeah, I think that there's a great risk of that happening. If things continue to go, I mean, just demographically, if you look at the numbers, there's a great risk of that happening over the next 75 to 100 years.
All right, let me ask you an interesting question. Before you wrote the article, did you feel Jewish?
Yes.
After you wrote the article, did you feel more Jewish or less Jewish?
I felt probably the same because my Judaism, for me, has been the same over the last 20 or 25 years, probably.
All right, you're married to a Jewish woman?
Yes, I am.
Because everybody here will write in letters, everybody's interested in that. Your kids are being brought up Jewish?
Yes, they are.
And you have children, sons?
I have a son and a daughter. My son will be bar mitzvahed, yes, and my daughter will be bat mitzvahed when she...
And your son goes to Hebrew school, not to Hebrew day school?
Right. He goes to regular public school, and he attends a Hebrew school a couple days a week.
I think it was Rabbi Buchwald in this article said that the best way to destroy Judaism is to send them to Hebrew school.
Right.
Right?
To send them to regular public school. And have them, well, this is an interesting question, and this is sort of one of the great sort of dirty little secrets of the Jewish community, which is that Hebrew school is terrible. The quality of Hebrew school education is awful, and I'm sure you'll have people who will scream and jump up and down and say, our Hebrew school is terrific, And I'm sure there are individual schools that work very well, but of all of the people I interviewed for this piece, the one thing everybody agreed on, and they agreed on very little, but the one thing all of them agreed on is the lack of quality of Jewish education. Jewish day schools are a different subject altogether. But the question then comes up, if this is a problem, if assimilation is a problem, if people being indifferent to their Jewish heritage is a problem, why isn't more attention paid to Jewish education?
Well, one of the reasons is that a lot of the Jewish leadership in various Jewish organizations are married to non-Jews. Male leaders are married to non-Jewish people. And I'm not going to name names here, but that's one of the problems. And I've talked about it with a lot of people. So that's an issue they really don't want to grapple with at this moment. They prefer to defer it and get to Israel and do things for Israel and get into Swiss bank accounts and do things which mobilize the Jews. And internally, I don't think they subject themselves to that type of scrutinization.
Well, that raises an interesting point, which is that why aren't the Jewish organizations, the major Jewish organizations who were so effective normally on all issues.
Right.
Why aren't they doing more about this particular issue? And I interviewed a number of executives, high-level executives at the major Jewish organizations, and they have ambivalent feelings about this, because if what it will mean going into the future to be a Jew, if it means that religion is more important, if you're not ethnically a Jew, you're religiously a Jew, and if that means you have to reject certain aspects of American society, if that means you have to reject certain things about modernity, then they all said, we'll take assimilation.
I know, I read that.
Yeah.
Very
They're not
interesting.
interested in becoming Orthodox. They're not interested in living in a sealed-off community someplace.
Did you interview Chabad people, Lubavitch people?
Yes, I did.
What was your impression? Are they growing?
Well, I know the Lubavitch people very well. I've written about them over the years. I wrote a piece when the Rebbe was sick and they were battling over who was going to be in charge and who was going to handle the future of the movement. And so I know the Lubavitchers very well. I've continued to maintain a relationship with them. Are they growing? They say they're growing, but I have no way of knowing if that's in fact true.
I think what's happened with the Lubavitcher, and probably Rabbi Greenberg might confirm this or not, is that after the Rebbe has expired and that some people don't acknowledge that he's really dead, it became a political problem there. And I've heard this from the Hasidim. And it became a power play, like every other organization. And somebody told me, it was interesting, a Hasidic Jew said to me, you know, Lubavitcher, we're really franchises. You can look at us as the McDonald's of Judaism. And each guy has his own territory, and he runs with it. So it's another way for people to go if they're Bal Tshuva. Let's take Ron Perlman. I'm sure you interviewed him. He's a very big donor to the Lubavitcher Hasidim.
Right.
Yet he is married to a non-Jewish girl.
Although she's converted.
She's converted. A good friend of mine, good Democrat.
Right.
Sat with her at the convention.
Right.
And she is converted, and they have a daughter, I'm sure will be brought up Jewish. It is so prevalent in our society. I just use Perlman as an example, and I think he's probably a really good Jewish guy. I think that's the reason that these Jewish organizations don't do it. I know there's a very good friend of mine who's listening to this show today, whose children and grandchildren have intermarried, and it really turns him over, and it really is hard for him. But sitting Shiva on one hand and dismissing these people totally is not within the realm of his idea of life, and he's going to accept them. Even if I have another friend of mine who's a yeshiva graduate who is son is marrying a non-Jew, not even with a rabbi, and it's driving him crazy, although in a sense he probably is an assimilated Jew today, but he can't bear it. And I asked him the question, what bothers you today? Why are you so disturbed by it? And he says, I can't pinpoint it. It's the schmaltz and the herring,
Right.
So it's a tough issue. It's a fascinating issue. The question is, did you meet anybody who really had an answer for this?
Well, everybody has an answer, but they're all different
Right.
answers.
Yeah. So there's no
yeah. I mean, that's the issue. If you look at one side, you mentioned Dershowitz before, and he did the book, and his feeling is that and he comes from an Orthodox background. He was brought up
very Orthodox.
So his feeling is, though, moving forward, the Jewish community has to be more open, more accepting, and really less rigid and less rigorous in the standards of who they will accept and who is a Jew. On the other side of the spectrum, you will be told, well, that's exactly what has created this problem in the first place, is by dropping the bar, so to speak, so that it's, you don't really have to do all that much to be Jewish. Well, if you don't have to do that much, if it's not that important, it's not that meaningful, then why be Jewish in the first place? So on the other side, the Orthodox will tell you that Judaism and Jewish law, that's the only way to go.
Craig, didn't Jews have the same problem in Germany when they really began to assimilate before Hitler? Did you study that part of Jewish history?
Yeah, it's a comparable period of time, but it's not really the same. And it's not the same because there were still limits placed on Jews in Germany.
And here it's free.
It really is. I mean, you will find you'll always find isolated incidents of anti-Semitism, but Jews really in American society are free to do whatever they want to do.
So, in a sense, this is the first time, according to what you have read, in our Jewish history, where we've been so free and have so much ability and have the ability to join society where we're living.
Absolutely. This is one of the reasons intermarriage is so prevalent on both sides. On the Christian side, there's no longer this resistance to marry Jews. I mean, Christians are eager in most parts of the country to marry Jewish people. And on the Jewish side, if the ethnic differences are disappearing, if they're diminishing, and if you're not religious per se, then why not marry somebody who's not Jewish? You're not that different. You're, you know.
All right, we got to cut for a break, and we're going to come right back with Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg, renowned scholar in Orthodox Judaism, and Jonathan Rosen, the cultural editor of The Forward, who's written a great book, and we'll have a great panel discussion. We'll be right back. We're back. I'm Leon Charney. We're talking about our American Jews disappearing, and we have a blue ribbon panel here. We have Jonathan Rosen, who's the cultural editor of The Forward, and has written a great book called Eve's Apple. We talked to Jonathan about a month ago, right, Jonathan? Mm-hmm. A book going well?
Yeah.
Jonathan's really considered a great new Jewish writer. You know, I call him the new Saul Bellow. He'll deny it, but who cares? What I say counts on this show. Yitzhak Greenberg, a great scholar and a creative Orthodox rabbi. It's the first time we've had him on the show. Welcome to the show. And Craig Horowitz, we've just talked to him about his piece in New York Magazine. Let's start with you. It's, you don't mind if I call you Yitz. I call the Israelis by their first name.
Some of my best friends call me Yitz.
All right. You heard Craig, and you read his article. What are your thoughts?
I think Craig was absolutely on target. The editors of New York Magazine dramatized the disappearance side of it, but I think the article and his words captured very well. There's two processes going on. There's a lot of revival and renewal going on as well. It's a race.
All right, Yitz, you have been iconoclastic, let's say, in the Orthodox rabbinate. What are the what was it? Fear? What are the Orthodox always don't treat you that well? Am I correct?
Well, there's an argument in the soul for the soul of the Orthodox community. I mean, the image you heard from Craig too is that the Orthodox represent let's withdraw from American life and make the Amish route.
Right.
That is my argument is that's the Haredi position, if you will, the traditionalist position. But that modern Orthodoxy, I believe, like the rest of the Jewish community, has got to come up with an integrated religious life inside American society. Otherwise, they're losing 90% of the Jews. The bulk of the modern Orthodox community, however, in the last decade has panicked under the fear of assimilation and basically has thrown the lot in with the Haredim, so they see my position as threatening or disturbing.
All right, Yeshiva University, the modern Orthodox university in the world, Rabbi Lamb and good friends of ours, what do they think of what you're doing?
That's a good question. I would say Yeshiva University, in Yeshiva University, Rabbi Lamb himself has become embattled. In other words, the Rosh Yeshiva, the traditionalist factor has become so powerful. He's the outsider. And I would say the administration has not fought for my position. They've basically thrown in the towel to the Rosh Yeshivas and agreed not to rock the boat, so to speak. But I think individuals and probably many students are sympathetic.
Where did you get your smicha, your ordination?
I got it from a place called Beis Yosef, which considers Yeshiva University far out, left-wing, moderate.
Really? So you got it.
I always joke about it. See, I went to a place that was so firm I didn't have to prove anything for the rest of my life. My friends who went to yeshiva spent the rest of their life looking over their right shoulder to make sure they're acceptable.
And high school?
Yeshiva University High School. And I taught at yeshiva for 13 years.
It was Talmudical Academy.
Right.
Jonathan, we can't have you silent. Craig's written a great article, a very strong, in-depth article, and I know that you don't think Jews are disappearing.
I don't think Jews are disappearing. And actually, what interests me most of all, I guess, are the psychological motivations behind the people who speak in the language of imminent disappearance. And I really think that something that's going on is an odd, delayed, complicated reaction to the Holocaust. I find these references to the spiritual Holocaust that's upon us really distressing and distasteful. And what I think is happening is that a conversation that would have made sense 50 years ago in Europe, will we in 5 or 10 years cease to exist as a community, are oddly taking place in America. There were real reasons to worry about the disappearance of the European Jew. The European Jew did disappear for very practical reasons. They were actually murdered. And I think there's almost an unconscious and I think perverse fantasy to reenact some of those conversations here in America. I felt it when I wrote critically about the Holocaust Museum in Washington, that there was an odd desire to re-experience almost vicariously the mood of the Holocaust, as if calamity has become the only way we feel authentic as Jews. And I think that there's a kind of almost a pathology. Now, maybe understandable, the wound of the Holocaust was tremendous. There are fewer Jews living in America now than were actually killed in the Holocaust. But that's what really interests me. And I think that that's something no one's really talking about. I think it's pervasive, though, and fascinating and disturbing.
That's an interesting point, Craig.
It is an interesting point. I think that the sense of calamity that you referred to is on target in the sense that somebody needs to stand up and say that the Jewish community needs to find a way to go forward and to put the joy, if you will, back in Judaism and being Jewish. Somebody has to provide a reason other than an external enemy or a calamity or some kind of a threat for people to want to be Jewish, for people to feel good about being Jewish. I think what's missing is this sense of what makes being Jewish important, what makes it fun, what makes it significant. I think that that's disappearing. And I think you need to find a way to do that without having some external enemy or without having some sense of impending danger.
He's saying internally it must come from within already. You can't look for the outside calamities to bring the Judaism to you. You're a community leader. Let's get going.
I see, but here I feel very strongly. I happen to agree with what Jonathan wants to get at and what Craig just said, but I think they've misapplied it to the Holocaust issue. The issue is, the future is the joy, the fulfillment, the way it can nurture community, the way the values can make your life worthwhile. That I have no question about it. Jonathan's review of the museum I felt was really one of the few times in my life, because I admire his writing very much. I thought it was almost perverse because he assumed that people went there to be, shocked and almost to get the SM, kicks from seeing the Holocaust. But in fact, I think it's the opposite. What the Holocaust fascination about Jews is, I think, is because it dramatizes the issue of modernity's limitations and dangers. And it's not a question of withdrawing from modernity. That's the Haredi solution. It's being in the culture but knowing its limitations. And I think the community has correctly sensed that the breakdown of modernity, which led to the Holocaust, is a very important signal for a total breakdown of modernity, which could happen to everybody unless they and the Jews find their religious dimensions and find values. So while I agree with the thrust of your concern, I really feel the Holocaust Museum has gotten this bum rap. The whole claim the Holocaust is death and death saturation. It's nonsense. Anybody who has dealt with survivors, you can't be overwhelmed by the thought that they have created new lives. The community, which is supposedly obsessed with Holocaust, has had the greatest outburst of life creation, of creating. I give the classic example. 80% of the rabbis and students of Talmud alive in 1939 were dead by 1945. In other words, 30% of the Jews, but 80% of the Talmud scholars. But in the last 50 years, they have rebuilt yeshivos in America and Israel to the point where there are more Talmud scholars studying today than ever before in Jewish history. That includes the Talmudic period and Eastern Europe. So it's not been a death obsession. It has been a kind of a challenge to life that has been responded to with incredible affirmations.
A rebirth.
Absolutely.
Jonathan?
I guess I would say that two poles are there the way they've always been there in the Bible. I've given you two ways, life and death, choose life. But the impulse towards the other is present. It was not a museum to Jewish culture that was built and that raised all that money in Washington. It was the Museum of the Holocaust. It was the termination of Jewish life, not the continuity of life, that was imported onto American soil. And all I really think is that, this is not a statistical or sociological observation. I just think that there's a generation of people who are like the men who grew up after the Second World War who never got to serve. They missed the great defining cataclysm, the great defining conflict of the century. They missed the Second World War, and they spent much of their lives feeling that they had missed something.
Do you think this is conscious or subconscious?
I think it is subconscious, but in Chutzpah, Dershowitz's book, the Jewish book that preceded the Vanishing American Jew, he says the greatest single factor in his life has been the Holocaust, and that he feels a constant sense of guilt that he didn't become a Nazi hunter. And in a sense, in his book, The Vanishing American Jew, what he gets to do is say, we're all about to disappear, and then in the same book, through a kind of complicated sleight of hand, save everybody by redefining the term Judaism to say that actually we can all be Jewish again. And I do think that there is something at work in the culture. It used to seem to me that children of survivors were a sort of marginal population in American Jewish cultural life. They were at odds with all these prosperous sons of well-to-do Americans. But I think in a certain way the psychology of children of survivors has in a weird way seeped into the larger culture as a whole. People assume that it could all be taken away from us.
I've had a theory that the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors don't have the same type of existence that I might have if my parents were not Holocaust victims. I've seen it, I don't know how to define it, but there is something different in their pathological makeup. I think it goes 3 generations, and we really don't know what the effect of it. That's a personal opinion.
Well, of course it has an emotional impact of enormous force to have a parent or a grandparent who lived through that kind of experience. But again, I think these are small truths that blind or that block out the big story, the big picture. The big picture is the incredible, overwhelming fact they rebuilt lives, they built in high-achieving, constructive...
No, we don't deny that.
I don't think anyone's disagreeing.
Nobody denies that.
So, but we're talking about pathology and obsession. I think you're missing, therefore, that bigger truth.
No, I don't even say it's an obsession. I say there's something different,
Well,
which I
Jonathan used the
can't
word
define.
obsession.
My roommate at Yeshiva University was a Holocaust survivor. He used to jump up in the middle of the night if he heard a siren, something akin to Israelis now when they hear a siren after the scudding.
I understand.
And I don't know what the effect of that is.
I think Jonathan was going to say that the piece ends with somebody saying that I used to ask my grandmother.
Heisenberg.
That's right.
Right, with Steve Eisenberg. I used to ask my grandmother how the Holocaust could happen. Where was everybody? What was everybody doing? And he says, I know that because I'm doing my part today, that when I have kids, my grandchildren will never sit on my knee and say to me, where were you at the end of the 20th century when the American Jewish community was vanishing?
That's right.
But I think that, I'm sorry to interrupt,
Excuse me.
I think that that's a very small percentage, I think, of the Jewish community. I think you have this problem sort of at the other extreme, which is that this incredible Jewish illiteracy and this distance and removal from certainly the Holocaust and anything prior to that in terms of Jewish history. I think that's, personally, I think that's more of a problem and more of an issue.
I couldn't agree with that more. I mean, I really do agree with that, but I do think that it's shaping the way in which we interpret these numbers. You quote Elliot Abrams in your piece as saying that if we dip to 2% of the population instead of 4% of the population, we may lose our claim to being the third great American religion. And I just think, since when did numbers become so important? Numbers are important because we suffered this incredible wound in which we lost 1/3 of the entire population, but really, I mean, 4% is a tiny amount. 2%
Jonathan,
is...
statistically, though, if you have 2% of the population and people want to get married, you have less chance of marrying a Jew.
I'm sure that that's true, but I'm also sure that fewer Jews came out of Egypt, say, with the Torah in tow than probably live in the 5 towns or on the island of Manhattan.
Numbers is not everything. You're right in that sense, but I want to remind you again, there's a minimum critical mass. You referred to it, Craig, before, in an open society. For example, again, New York City has the lowest intermarriage rates of any place in the country. There's a lot of Jews around. Not only do they meet each other, but they create a Jewish environment, and there's, including the bagels, by the way, for all the making fun of it. It's part of feeling Jewish is natural, and it's cultural, and it's part of your life, which is not, again, to back away from the other truth, which is central. What's the vitality? What's the power of the religious culture? What's the sense? Do you, in fact, if you live Jewishly, will you have a more satisfying sex life? I'm not joking. Will you have a more fundamentally fulfilling relationship of parents and children? If it works, then I think it will maintain itself in an open, integrated society, and therefore knowledge and experience is absolutely the key.
All right, let me throw out a point that when we were doing Camp David, there was a little problem that Ezer Weitzman had with Menachem Begin. And a quote from Weitzman was, Menachem Begin walks with the Holocaust in front of him. I walk with the Israeli Defense Forces behind me. You want to characterize that statement?
I don't. Do you want to characterize that statement?
Again, these are all shorthand images. There's a certain truth to them, but it doesn't do justice. First of all, the Israelis were
well, that's what I'm bringing in. I'm bringing Israel into play now.
They were galvanized by the Holocaust. Support for Israel was galvanized by the Holocaust. It's much too glib. It also implies somehow that Holocaust is an obsession with death. And I say again, look at the classic Jewish tradition. They were all talking about life. After the destruction of the temple, every day in the prayers, at every meal, at every wedding you break a glass, and every holiday you have a reminder that the temple was destroyed. Is this a death obsession? No, it isn't. The answer is, frankly, if you had a narrow escape from death, then every time you dance at a wedding or you kiss your wife or you hug your friend, you remind yourself what a blessing it is that I survived that death.
A wedding has 7 days and a shiva has 7 days, right?
Fair enough.
But I don't know that I don't feel myself that I'm disagreeing with you at all. I just do think that this is a kind of unconscious current in the culture now.
Jonathan, I got to disagree. We got to cut
Fine.
for a break. We'll come right back. We have 3 Jews together. They must disagree. It's the fundamental part of Judaism.
Right.
We're back. We're having a fascinating and important conversation with 3 scholars here. Craig Horowitz, who's written an article for New York Magazine, Are American Jews Disappearing? Yitzhak Greenberg, who's a renowned Orthodox Jewish rabbi and scholar, and our new Saul Bellow, Jonathan Rosen, who's written Eve's Apple. We had him on the show a couple of weeks ago. Everybody has a point of view. This is really a Jewish show if everybody has a point of view. I just asked Yitzhak Greenberg, I said, one of the problems that I see happening is that if you talk to an Orthodox Jew and try to have a dialogue with him, if you're conservative and reform, he really can't have that dialogue because he's afraid if he gives a little bit, he's giving up his position. Is that true? Or?
Well, I think that is the perception right now in the Orthodox community by and large. I also think it's mistaken. You may have seen the newspaper accounts that the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations pressured the agency to stop using the term pluralism because they argued it's a synonym for undermining orthodoxy.
You hit a hotbed. I'm going to tell about it. Craig has the article. The Orthodox Union wanted to give me an award in September, and I rejected it on the grounds that they gave L'Oreal an award, and L'Oreal at least had some heavy background of Nazism, and I said, before they give them trophies, let's wait a couple of generations. And they're very strong. They're a powerful group, and they're very pedantic and sanctimonious, and they don't even want to hear arguments about it. And that disturbs anybody who has a thinking mind. Anyway, it's a side issue. Jonathan.
Well, I don't know if I can let you get with sanctimonious and pedantic. A little rough. I have to say something in their defense. I think of it as a little lacking in imagination, or maybe a little narrow-minded.
How about if they tell me beans are kosher, but they should not kosher the misdeeds of what Nazis did to Jews?
By the way, I happen to agree with you on L'Oreal, so I'm not going to quarrel at all. I think that was a genuinely bad judgment and a very, very poor taste. But everybody's entitled to that, right?
Yeah. But I think the internecine battling is an important issue.
Individually, they're entitled to it, but when an organization comes out and says, this is what we believe, and this is what it's for the CLAL Yisrael, for the benefit of all of Israel, that's what I call sanctimonious and pedantic. That's irritating. You and I can have a different opinion, but if we funnel it through an organization and we kosher, in a sense, some misdeeds of the past, what Nazis did, and believe me, The Scent of L'Oreal, which was written by Michael Brazeau, I was on his show, is a terrible indictment of that company. And we've seen enough of what's going on with the Swiss bank. We don't know what's going on. We don't know the half-truths. I have D'Amato coming on this show. I read Bauer's book, Nazi Gold. I mean, we really don't know what went on there. So let's wait a little bit before we give trophies to these people. Anyway, that's my own gripe, but I think it'll become it's not a Leon Charney gripe. It's what we're all talking about today. It's about talking and thinking and trying to get to a point where we can agree with one another. Another person would be totally turned off by that situation. Jonathan, to you, what is a Jew? You wrote Eve's Apple. You can answer that question.
Oh, I don't know if I can answer that question.
All right, if you can't,
really.
you pass.
I don't think it's anyone who considers himself Jewish, though. I think, although part of me wants to give that answer, I think there needs to be a community to recognize that choice as well. And that's a complicated interaction between an individual and a community. And we're seeing some of that breaking down now as there are communities inside of Judaism that don't recognize other people's sense of themselves as Jewish. And I mean, that I do think is going to be a coming crisis.
Right, it's...
Well, the coming crisis is here already, I think.
But what is a Jew to you?
Well, I accept the classical tradition view that it's a Jewish mother or conversion to Judaism. I also think that you have to make room.
Conversion by whose standards?
Yeah, first of all, you have to deal with the issue of whose standards is conversion. Furthermore, I honestly feel, and that's what Jonathan was hinting at, that the community has to provide some status and some open welcome to people who are on the fringe or halachically not acceptable, because I think that they are, in fact, potential. And so instead
that statement is 10,000 letters. to this show.
Okay, instead of
But
being,
again, halakha
instead
is
of
not
being,
acceptable to whom?
no, so my answer is up to now acceptable neither to Orthodox nor conservative, by the way. Part of, I think, Reform made a fundamental mistake in patrilineal, acting irresponsible toward CLAL Yisrael because it ignored the other two denominations, conservative and Orthodox. I sometimes say cynically that they said openly that with the conservative movement, they thought they'd end up winning because the lay people won't support the rabbis. So as the rabbis are against it, but they think the lay people will accept it. But that's another way, I would say, a fundamental disrespect for your conservative colleagues to base your policy on the fact that they'll be ineffectual or not listened to.
Yes, you have wonderful ideas, and they seem to be radical to a typical Orthodox Jewish community. How are you? How do people come to you? How do they respect you? Are they angry at you? What happens to you when you come out? These are tremendous viewpoints.
In the Orthodox community, you mean?
Orthodox Jewish community.
Well, there's a wide range of response, including people who feel that I'm beyond the pale and people who have actively tried to boycott me. But, this is too important an issue to be silent for, and I think the future of the Jewish people is at stake, and I feel that what's weakening us, this fight between denominations, is catastrophic now, because when you should be putting all your energy into reviving Jewish life, and frankly, even if you had a fantastic revival, it's going to take multiple approaches. If the Orthodox had 100% of the truth and 100% of the legitimacy, it would still be wrong to try it for monopoly, because in fact there are thousands, millions of Jews who won't listen to you. So you want to hold them and reach them through other people. But unfortunately, Orthodoxy has been sort of unable to solve the intellectual and philosophical issues, and therefore I think painted itself into a corner here.
Craig, what is a Jew to you?
Well, I think it's what I said before. I think that this is a major issue as to how you define a Jew. I think that we're headed towards a point at which somebody saying he or she is a Jew makes them a Jew, I think. I think if you have a community where you're not willing to accept people who are not converted according to certain standards.
Wait, an Irish girl comes to you and says, I want to marry a brother or sister, or brother rather, and she says, I want to be a Jew. Is that a Jew?
Without doing anything, you mean?
The mere declaration that she wants to be a Jew.
I think that's a first step. I think that that's a first step. I think that some process of education has to take place at that point. I think that to set the bar higher for that person than you would for somebody whose mother is a Jew is a really complicated issue and a really complicated question. I think the community has to begin to make some determinations as to how they want to deal with intermarried couples and how they want to treat the children of intermarried couples, particularly when a formal conversion process hasn't taken place, and also particularly when those people go to synagogue.